Hi. I think we can probably get started. My name's Nika. I'm the Graduate Programming and Events Coordinator at CESTA. We'd like to welcome everyone to CESTA for the pre-penultimate seminar in our Fall 2020 programming series. You can visit the CESTA website for a detailed overview of our upcoming programming, recordings of past events, and more. Today, we're really happy to welcome Dr. Christina Hodge, Curator and Collections Manager at the Stanford Archaeology Center. She will be presenting on her new pedagogical exhibit, Modeling Mesoamerica, an interactive display of 3D physical and digital reproductions. I'll post details on the opening of the exhibition, which is happening this Friday at 2:45 in the chat shortly. And I'll also post some details about the Q&A in there, so keep an eye on it. I think in the meantime, I'll pass the baton over to Dr. Laura Stokes, who will introduce Dr. Hodge.
Great, thanks, Nika. Hello, everyone, and welcome to CESTA. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Christina Hodge. Christina is affiliated with the Stanford Archaeology Center, which, as I only learned this year from Christina, holds a museum quality collection of over 30,000 objects from California and around the world. She serves there as the academic curator and collections manager, in which position she's responsible for daily operations and long-term planning across all areas of collection work. Christina also provides expertise and leadership, not only in direct collections management, but also in the use of the collection and its objects for exhibitions, research, outreach, and teaching. At SUAC, Christina has initiated best practices for collections use and has worked to strengthen partnership with allied groups across campus, including CESTA. In addition to this considerable work in managing the collection and facilitating its use, Christina has pioneered a new interpretation-focused exhibition program and has developed a museum anthropology course using the collection. Today, she'll discuss her work in creating a new virtual exhibit through her collection-based curation course. That exhibit, as Nika mentioned, will be opening with a virtual tour on Friday with some of the student curators present to show you around the exhibit. A link is available through the CESTA events page for that opening. Today's talk is entitled Modeling Mesoamerica, Origins and Opportunities in a Digital Exhibit. Please join me in welcoming Christina with a display of dancing hands if you've got your video on, or virtual clapping if you haven't. Take it away, Christina. You're muted. How do we unmute? There we go. Try that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here today and to share this project with you and to generally continue, as was mentioned, this kind of growing collaborative relationship between the Archaeology Center and the archaeology collections, which is really my kind of home and purview there, and with CESTA in these different kinds of modes of digital humanities. And I think that museums, archaeology and museums are really at home in the digital world, and it's only a growing part of our interpretive and research practice. And so I really learn a lot every time I attend one of these talks. And so it's fun / potentially challenging, we'll see, to be on the other end of giving one of these right now. But I'm really pleased to share this project with you, and also want to frame it as a bit of an experiment. So like a lot of basically everybody, I think, let's say not a lot, but everybody, like everybody, we really had to do a lot of reorientation and scrambling and really innovative thinking about our teaching and research and practices last spring, when things all moved digital, all moved virtual, just before we were going to start teaching our spring exhibit course. And you can imagine also that as a material culture shop whose main message is that hands-on experiential learning is the thing we do, figuring out how to translate that message for students and really just kind of for ourselves into this digital world for a virtual exhibit, our first real virtual exhibit that we've done. was a bit of a challenge. And so I'll talk about kind of what we did, how we took our ethos and our methods and kind of translated them as we could to the digital in a way that was true to our values and true to our kind of mission and vision of what we are, and kind of where that worked really well and opened up new potentials for how we interpret and present material culture and our critical thinking about it. But also some stuff was a bit challenging, as you can imagine. And so I'll be talking about that as well. So basically the plan for the presentation part today is I'll do a bit of a PowerPoint, give an introduction, and then talk about the origins of the digital exhibit, which is basically what we thought we were going to do in a pre-existing SESTA partnership. And then the opportunities in the exhibit, which is what we actually ended up doing as the SESTA partnership grew from what was supposed to be a supplemental little kind of geospatial mapping thing into the entire digital publication, really, of the exhibit itself, and kind of how that shift happened. And then finally, some lessons from this, because I definitely have learned kind of lessons for moving forward. And I think that there's both kind of positives and negatives that it would be great to talk about more if we have time during the Q&A too. I'm really interested in other people's experiences moving things online. So with that, I am going to start sharing the screen and go to this PowerPoint. If you'll just give me a second. Okay. Okay, so you should be seeing PowerPoint at this point, seeing some nods, thumbs up. All right, perfect. Okay, so all right, so as I said, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. And so this is an introduction to SUAC, a little bit to our collections, and really to where this exhibit came from as a concept and some of the content of it. So as Laura mentioned, she learned that the Archaeology Center has a museum collection, basically. The numbers for that collection, though, she cited were about 30,000 objects, which is now a running joke because what we've been doing is an inventory project since 2018. And the grand total of our objects now is over 90,000, and we are anticipating breaking 100,000. So when I started my position back in 2014, we did have around 30,000 objects that we knew of, but we know about a lot more now. So we have had some new acquisitions through campus archaeology, which is really active, but we've just been going through those boxes. And you can see some of my staff here, Sarah, Susie, and Veronica in various roles of this inventory, finding things, discovering things, reorganizing things, cleaning things, all of the work that had really been long deferred in this collection before it was brought back to campus just in 2014. And so it's really being rehabilitated. And the project today and the focus of this museum cultures course I teach every year is basically on a different little nugget within this global collection. So we can just start learning more about it, start doing some outreach around it, and start communicating just how diverse and deep these materials are. So we can better connect them with campus community, with originating communities, and really start to kind of use them in the way they should be used and really understand them in the way they should be understood. So there's been a lot of work for that. One of the discoveries in this process, and there have been many more, but one of the most kind of fun and surprising discoveries, and really the inspiration for this exhibit that we ended up doing, was a rather beat up poster tube that we found on a shelf in our space that had a lot of things written on it, including traveling exhibit posters, Merle. And so we were very excited to see what was in this tube. And when we unpacked what was in there and unrolled it, we found these, which are stunning rubbings of Maya monumental carvings, so stela from a couple classic Maya period sites in Guatemala, Honduras, These pieces of paper, you don't exactly get the size here from these really beautiful digitizations that the libraries helped us with, but each piece of paper is about 3 feet by 5 feet. So these things are just big and gorgeous. And so we decided that these would be a really surprising and important thing for us to learn more about and potential focus for the class. And then along with this, and this is a picture of Merle Robertson doing some of her rubbing work, so you can get a sense of just how big these things are and how they were produced directly in contact with these very well-known Maya monuments. And then besides that, we also found a bunch of other reproductions or copies, or we can talk about the terminology. We ended up calling them models or replicas, but just a lot of stuff from different Mesoamerican sites or peoples. You can see me kind of introducing these things on what was our last public event on World Anthropology Day in February. And then this shot here is of our collection of Mesoamerican models or Mesoamerican teaching replicas. But you can also see here a lot of these T numbers. Out of all of these objects, only one of them was in a museum catalog that we knew anything about. Everything with a T number, that's a temporary number that we assigned in a pilot project or in the inventory, which means we had zero documentation for any of these things about when they came in, what they were, who made them or used them or anything. And so this was a prime collection to use for our museum cultures class. Because what I basically do there is, as I said, turn a group of students loose on a portion of the collection that we really want to learn more about. So this was the one we decided to focus on for 2020. This is what it normally looks like to do a museum cultures course, where we have lots of hands-on work, students looking in records, building exhibit mounts in our collections lab, in our collections space, and then putting those on display over at the Archaeology Center. And so this is what we were expecting to be doing with all of these things here. And what I expected to be focusing on then was, this idea of Mesoamerica and the idea of modeling. And so the question of, we throw around the term Mesoamerica, but what does that really mean? Maybe these objects that we have can help us think about that. Mesoamerica as a kind of construct of the scholarly imagination and popular imagination for a bunch of different reasons. And it seemed like our objects were probably 20th century and probably had a lot to do with that transformation of kind of the, after the Mexican Revolution, this kind of revisioning of what it meant to be from Latin America or Central America. And there's a lot going on in this particular image here, but this kind of the appropriation or revitalization of ancient materials across the Americas. But what that also resulted in was a lot of flattening of cultures, homogenization of time periods and traditions. And so what Mesoamerica is, when you really try to get down to it, is kind of a fuzzy construct. And so I expected to be and wanted to be focusing on that with the class as we were examining this collection of Mesoamerican models that we had. And then also thinking about how these things were used, right? Like, why did we have them at all? They're in a museum, and so we can assume they were, teaching our museum collections. And for some of them, like those rubbings from Merle Green Robertson, those were actually displayed at Stanford in the 60s. And so we know that they had kind of an art and museum background. But as this, one of my new favorite images from the Library of Congress shows, the plaster modeling of Mesoamerican objects is not just an intellectual or scholarly pursuit. If we've got one here doing some communication in this baby photograph. So really trying to understand the history of our models and what they had done before they came to Stanford, and then what they were doing at Stanford. Kind of what are they? Where are they from? Those really basic questions. And then that idea of modeling, I thought would be a really good through line to the contemporary use of these objects as well, because we've got them as museum artifacts, but part of what we do now in partnership with the digitization group at the Stanford Libraries is a lot of 3D scanning. So we are producing models ourselves of artifacts all the time, and are more or less critical about that process. And so looking at our Mesoamerican models was a way to give a history to this process of 3D modeling as a continuation of modeling for study and research and entertainment and for fun and for weird cultural appropriation and for all of these different things that come up, and have kind of a critical understanding of our own continuing practices, and really kind of explicitly with this project connect past and present in that way. So that's the background, that's the inspiration and the kind of collection we were focusing on. And with all of those ideas and goals and kind of focus, want to turn a little bit now to the origins, which is basically, what I thought we were going to be doing as we were going through and doing that museum cultures class in the spring. And what this really is then is kind of the way the project was looking in the winter, right? So last winter, and that's when we really started our SESTA collaboration. So I knew I wanted to have that physical exhibit, but as we've started to do, I wanted to have a digital interactive supplement to that. There's so much to say about these collections, and the students themselves do so much work and discovery. And there's only, that tip of the iceberg that makes it into the exhibit. And that's absolutely part of the exhibit process as a process of inquiry, critical inquiry, and as a pedagogy method as well, is, focus and figuring out what your message is, really honing that message, using text and object and image together to communicate, thinking about it as experienced. All of that is absolutely important. But the digital component that we've started to add really kind of allows us to go beyond what you can do in a physical exhibit to create a kind of interactive dynamic supplement, and something that just has a longer lifespan and can commemorate the students' work and hopefully be used by other people, more broadly, all of the usual advantages. So we had that in mind when we were talking to SESTA in winter of last year, trying to figure out what we're going to do. So I thought we were going to do a physical exhibit, and this is pictures from the 2019 exhibit of Northwest Coast art that we have. So this is what I thought was going to be happening in the spring. We'd have this physical exhibit, and then we'd have, as part of the physical exhibit, we'd use QR codes in that space that you could then scan and go to the 3D models that I mentioned, which we were already making with the libraries in the winter and the early spring, because we knew we wanted to have them. So we had a leg up on the 3D models. We're planning for those to be just part of the public exhibit kind of interpretation side of things. But at least we had started with that. And then with SESTA, I was thinking that the kind of best and most useful ways to use the partnership there was in some geospatial mapping that could tie into our themes for the exhibit and for the models. So some of those themes, as I said, we're really interested in materiality, we're really interested in objects as agents, as primary sources. And we always, in the teaching that I do through the collections, we start with the object and then move out to the interpretation, right? I'm not coming at these things saying, I would really like to do an exhibit about Mesoamerica. I'm coming at this saying, what did we just find? Okay, let's start with that and then kind of move out from it to see what's going on. And so I thought that the mapping would help us visualize the connections between these models and not only ancient sites, but the process of their formation, like where these models came from, which we were discovering was a lot from, ties to the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, ties to other places. And so really starting to connect these things beyond Stanford. And then also what we wanted to do with the map was to integrate the originals and the models. So they're not kind of separate objects, but think of them as really interrelated and relational kind of wholes. And so we decided that we wanted to do a map with 4 stops on it. One where the model is today, which is at Stanford, a second stop for each of those models where it was made. So connecting to the museum or the original site where the model maker actually produced this model as an object in its own right. And then connecting to the original, where's the original today? So let's think about that. And then also the original where it was made. So there was some parity between kind of where is it now, maybe in a museum, versus where was it actually made, both for the models and the originals that inspired them. So this is what I was talking about with our wonderful SESTA intern in the winter, Morel Vargas. And so she was really interested in doing ArcGIS. This is a mock-up map that she made to really do this. And so this was the main thing that I wanted to accomplish with SESTA as of winter 2021, was this kind of interactive base map with photos and information about each of these stops on the object's itineraries. And then a supplemental, kind of the stretch goal for the SESTA project at that time in the winter, was to have interactive annotated images of those 2 rubbings, because there is so much going on with them, and they're, you know, the originals are so huge that that idea of getting some of the scale by that capacity to zoom in, and some of that interactive experience of giving you kind of a tour of the iconography and the methods that are reflected in these rubbings, was another kind of idea that I had that I thought would be a really great contribution supplemental to the exhibit. And so I know there was some annotation in IIIF that you could do through Mirador. We talked about this and thought about this, and this ended up not being a great fit for what we wanted to do, but this is kind of where we wanted to go. And so basically at the end of winter, we came up with a solution for us, which was to use ESRI Storymaps and take advantage of the ArcGIS plugin there. So Morel had some ArcGIS experience, and that really seemed to be the best platform for the kind of mapping that was our priority. And conveniently, ESRI had recently put up tutorials and created an integrated tool into the Storymaps site that kind of showed you how to use ArcGIS base maps as a way to use images as the base map and kind of do the tour, an interactive tour, where you can kind of zoom around and have annotations and supplemental information, do all of that actually through the Storymaps site. So using Storymaps would allow us to have a single platform solution instead of like, oh, we're in Mirador here, but we're in ArcGIS there, or something like that. It's really dynamic. There's a lot of features. It's designed for interactive storytelling, which is what I wanted. And it can be multi-platform in that if you're looking at it at a computer, that's great. But in my mind, people are looking at some of this content in the exhibit space on their mobile devices. And so the fact that ESRI Storymaps can automatically kind of resize and reorient the content for an iPad or a phone or a desktop was really, really attractive as well. And so also there's some good experience, obviously, work with ArcGIS and Storymaps also at Stanford. And so as someone with 0 experience, even with ArcGIS, even though I'm trained as an archaeologist, I think I slipped through just before they did good training on that stuff as just part and parcel of your PhD work and undergrad work and such. I was really happy to find experts around who could really support Morel and me as we're learning and kind of working through some of this. So those are all the things feeding into the selection of Storymaps last winter as our kind of tool of choice for this interpretive and visualization project. All right, so that's what we thought we were going to do, and that's what we were working on over the winter, kind of doing some mock-ups, finding our tools, thinking about these goals of connecting the originals to the objects, focusing on materiality, having something that was interactive, all of that. So the opportunity then in the exhibit is basically what we actually ended up doing. And so this is basically, think of this as kind of post-COVID work. So the quote unquote pivot, which we really need to find a better word for, reinvention maybe, restart for what we did based on the New World Order that we had. So the way I've set it up in this slide, and I'll kind of talk through that, but this is just a kind of a summary of how the changes from in-person hands-on, all the students in a room, immersive research and teaching that we usually do with collections, how that got impacted and how we accommodated the virtual teaching, work from home, and switch from a physical to a virtual exhibit. So obviously we moved from physical to virtual and the exhibit, and that triggered a lot of redesign in the syllabus. So it wasn't just like take the syllabus and, oh, we're just virtual now. The readings in support of the project had to shift from readings focused on experiencing physical displays to readings focused on how Mesoamericans specifically and other kinds of museum content were experienced virtually. And I'm happy to share the syllabus with anybody who's interested, just let me know. Also, this focus from artifacts to digital surrogates, this was a huge change for us. Because usually, as I said, as you saw in those photos, like we are hands-on, that is our thing. And so without the hands-on, it became a little tricky. We were able to use those 3D models. That really became the primary object of study for our students. So I'm really grateful that we were already, had those mostly in the bag before the shutdown, and the libraries really kind of pushed to make sure we finished those in time for the students to have those as objects of study so that they could virtually, turn it around and do all sorts of things with them, including things that you can't do with a physical object, right? Like sometimes pick it upside down or zoom into it and see what the inside looks like, all of those kinds of things we were able to do. And then also there was a huge digitization push from my staff to photograph objects, scan records, do conservation assessments with detailed photographs of, scuff marks and use wear and cracks, all of those kinds of things that normally the students just show up and look at them, easy peasy. We were suddenly having to document with photography, which, to be clear, we should and want to do with every object anyway, but we just haven't had the capacity to do it in the past. And so this was, we got it done, but it was a real push to do that. And then kind of the focus of the critical part of the class shifted from materiality to virtuality. So the idea of, how do material cultures serve as agents and witness and kind of the relationships built through material culture. It got this virtual gloss. So what is virtual materiality became a conversation. What's different between virtual and physical? How do we manifest the physicality of these objects in a virtual way became a big part of the discussions. What was consistent was that we were still dealing with models. So physical models and the idea of digital models became even more central to what we were doing than I had imagined it would be. So that we actually kind of gained, and actually was, if we had to choose anything to be a topic for this switch to the digital, so involved in creating the 3D digital models and those really high resolution scans of the rubbings. Like this was the perfect exhibit to do it with. So we really just lucked out is part of why we were able to complete the project as well as we have been. And so for SESTA, finally, this shift really went from SESTA being, a supplemental thing where we're going to have this great little interactive map on the side to like, no, this is it, right? Like whatever we're doing with SESTA is now the exhibit platform. And so the fact that we had already chosen Storymaps, that it was so visual and was so interactive, we looked out there as well. But what this required was kind of Morel and GP Laborde, who I must thank also, who was really instrumental in this shift and through the whole project when he was with SESTA last year. It went from supplemental to primary. And so the scope and the amount of work and the amount of education I needed to figure out what was going on, the document management and tracking, data management, versioning, all of those things really just blew up in terms of how much work they were taking. And so SESTA's project went from some, content design to really like multimedia platform design. And what that really ended up doing is creating closer ties, though, between the SESTA project and the class. And I think of all of the outcomes, that's probably the biggest lesson and the most rewarding, is the way that the projects became much more close as the kind of the digital content became the focus of the class. All right, so what I'd like to do now then is jump out of this and give you a little bit of a preview of the exhibit itself. I'm not focusing as much necessarily on the content. That'll be the focus of Friday's talk, but kind of giving you a sense of some of the kind of structural and interpretive moves we made to carry those themes that we developed and our values as a museum and kind of physical-based exhibit space into this digital realm. So I'm going to stop the share, and then I am going to get that out of the way and move over to modeling Mesoamerica. Okay, taking the sweater off, getting serious. All right. Okay, so modeling Mesoamerica. You should be seeing the website now. Okay, great. So I'm in, this is the Storymaps website. I'm in its kind of preview mode. So you can see here, it would allow me to, click and see what it would look like on a phone, or click and see what it would look like on a tablet, but we'll keep full screen. And we really designed it mostly for the full screen view. Because even though it switches between them, there's some things that are gained and lost in the different modes, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. But overall, this is our splash here, and so the way that we organized this is quite different than we would have with the physical exhibit. In the exhibit, we would have, we had 4 exhibit teams, or no, we ended up with, I think, 3 exhibit teams, 1 for each model maker. So 1 team focusing on all the models by Robertson, those rubbings that you saw, 1 team focusing on all of the models that we learned were by an artist named Francisco Cornejo, made in the 1920s, and then another focused on models made by an artist named Mary Louise Baker that were made in the 1930s. So we had these like 3 teams based on the artists. And so we would have had like an intro case, and then each team would have had their own case. But that is not what we did. That didn't really work in the digital realm. We could have done it that way, but what we ended up doing is moving the digital structure to much more closely reflect the students' process of creating an exhibit. And so the ways that the students moved into learning about the material culture and then contextualizing it kind of backwards, stepwise through time in a kind of reverse biography in a way. So we've got the introduction and then different sections in which we introduce the models, which is literally what I called the lecture, right? That week on the syllabus was Meet the Models. And so we've got the Meet the Models section here in the website. And then kind of the next, if it were a physical exhibit room, if it were a book chapter, whatever you want to think about it. The next thing we move to is kind of the next step back in time. So who made these models? Why did they make these models? Where did they make these models? So makers and motives is the next section of the exhibit this way. And so following that is the next step back in time, which is moving to the ancient originals that then inspired these models. So, the overall, and we talked about this a lot in class, the move when you see an artifact reproduction is to think about that original artifact. You almost look through the reproduction and don't kind of dwell on it as its own artifact, as its own object. But we wanted to be all about dwelling on these models. We were really interested in those. And so keeping the focus on the models and then moving back to the ancient originals is the choice we made to really keep that message within the structure of the exhibit itself. And then finally, we've got a reflection section, which got to be a lot bigger than it normally would be. Normally, this doesn't really make it into exhibits. The students don't get a chance to kind of reflect on what they learned in a way. And so it was really nice to be able to add that, a little bit more student voice than we can get in the physical exhibit. And then finally, the end matter, which like blew up, right? Like this does not exist in a physical exhibit. We got a bibliography here. We've got the thank yous, but every student curator has their own personal curatorial statement, not even a team statement. And so the idea here of making labor visible, making voices visible, which are small decolonial moves, but part of that idea of, breaking down museum authority, making the process and the limits of our understanding transparent, all of those kind of things, these sections really do that in a way that's quite strong compared with a physical exhibit. So that's the overall structure. Let's talk a little bit about some of the actual features in the story map, so you can kind of see how we integrated those. So story map is basically one big scroll that goes by, and we started in the introduction with just kind of a central scroll and our leading statement, which is what happens when we consider models of Central American antiquities not as copies of something else, but as cultural artifacts in their own right. So this is let you know front and center what this exhibit is about. And that we then discover that their meaning depends on why they were made and collected, as well as on the ancient originals they interpret. That was always what the exhibit was going to be about. And so here we can really keep that front and center. And then things get crazy. So that moment when you walk into an exhibit and you're surrounded by the objects, this is a more or less successful attempt to reproduce that, where you see all of the different images of the objects that are going to be in the exhibit, not in any great detail, but kind of all together as a population, right, as a community of objects, which they are now. And then one of the great things that we were able to make use of, which is a feature that was added to story maps after we started working on it, so this was a very new feature as we were developing this over the summer, is the kind of integrated sliders. So in this case, we have a slider of that map of Mesoamerica, complicating the idea of geopolitical boundaries by including tribal and language boundaries on top of it. And so that idea of, what is Mesoamerica really? Who's really there? That flattening and homogenizing that happens when you just call it Mesoamerica. This is one really strong way within the structure of story maps that we were able to kind of complicate that right off the bat. And so I really enjoy putting that. Plus sliders are fun. Who doesn't like playing with sliders? So we were able to introduce that as well. And so in the Meet the Models section, this is where we start to use some of the other features of story maps. So this idea of including an image to kind of mark a transition. This is different in the story maps, but allows us to add more images of process and of people than we would be able to do otherwise in our space. And so that's really great. And then one of the things that you can do here as well is there's the linear move in story maps, but then there's like sideways moves too. So in the slideshow, this is the first slide, which is a lovely picture, but if you want to know more about it, you click on the arrow and it will tell you more. So we're able to put a little gloss and source and a little more interpretation about these images if people are interested. So in a physical exhibit, the opt-in and opt-out is really important for people as they're kind of browsing around. And so we wanted to have that capacity here as well. Plus, not gonna lie, as a curator, I tend to like writing words about stuff. And so the ability to add a little bit more content about images like this one, kind of who's here, where is it, and what's going on was really, really pleasing to me. Maybe too pleasing, which we can talk about when we talk about some of the lessons. And so this is the main, what's called Sidecar. So it's a side-by-side scrolling. And so this was really important for us because we could keep that object front and center as you saw contextualizing and supplemental information about it and images about it on the side. And so Meet the Models is the most like a physical exhibit would have been. And we could have stopped there and not had all these other sections to talk about what the students discovered about the makers and talk about what they discovered about the ancient originals. But of course, we put it all in there, which is why we were working on it until last week. But that's fine. So one of the great things too is that because of iframes, we were able to integrate these 3D models. And so it's not just, here's our inventory photo of the object, but you don't really get a sense of what this looks like from a single inventory photo. And so we do have the 3D model that you can click on and it will load on the iPhone, it'll punt into a separate window, but on desktop, it'll load it here. And then you can start playing with it. So you can say, oh, this is, it's round. This is what the top looks like. You can kind of rotate the object around to kind of see different sides, see the bottom of the object, which you're obviously not going to get to see in a physical exhibit, and do things like kind of zoom in and out. And so for the students, what they did here to kind of make up and keep centering that physical experience is, include the inventory image. I worked over the summer with my staff to figure out how to get a sense of scale into this exhibit, because that's often really, really hard. And so we came up with this kind of silhouette conceit where we've got silhouettes of a variety of people. And then we have the black and white kind of grayed out images of our models next to an image of the original at scale. So this particular model is the second one here. So on the table, it's, it's small. It's like this, but the original is like 9 feet, several tons, huge. And so you can start to see that different material qualities. And then the idea that models are not just reproductions, that there's a lot of choice and creativity and editing that happens in the model making process is a big message of the exhibit. And so starting to work that into the design here was really important for us as well. And so this we can kind of scroll through all the different models, have their day using these different kind of capacities of the sidecars. All the different 3D scans are there. And then I did want to highlight one of the really important SESTA contributions, which was Morel working on these interactive images. And so using the images as a base map, basically, we're able to include the navigation capacity built into ArcGIS plus ESRI here. So for this image, if you click on one of these tags here, it will, yes, do it. You want to. There we go. It'll zoom into the portion of the image that this is describing. So the mask, in this case, that Ruler 3 is wearing. And then if you click in that circle, it'll pull up more supplemental information about it. And there's instructions here for folks using the website. So there's a lot here. And in fact, more, you'd be able to do some of this in a physical exhibit, but there's more than we'd be able to. And it's a lot more kind of interactive than it would be maybe in the physical exhibit, where it's a little bit more passive for the viewer to tack back and forth between these things. So this was really successful. This is a lot of what Morel was able to do for us. So that's great too. So the, let's see, so she did it for this one as well. And I'll encourage everybody to explore the really deep content of the exhibit when you get a chance. So makers and motives, ancient originals, both of these things are also really taking the idea of centering the object and then putting the supplemental information to heart. There's some really great visuals, more text than we'd be able to include in the physical exhibit that reflect the students' work and some of these important connections. And then I wanted to just highlight a little bit of the end matter before going back and talking about our lessons. So as I said, the idea of the end matter is really marking how different this is from a physical exhibit. This is really ended up being a digital publication. There's linear stuff, there's sideways stuff, there's interactive stuff. We're using a bunch of the different features that Storymap has. But one of the things we really realized is that, this is online, this is forever, and it's a way for us to get more of the student voice out and also, cite our work, put down references, mark the labor and the connections that are part of this exhibit. So here we have the curatorial statements from all of the students that if you go through the slideshow kind of sideways in the website, you'll see their different smiling faces and personal statements. And these never make it into the physical exhibit. There's just not space for every student, 14 students to have an essay about how they reacted to the course, what their takeaways are, what they want you to know when you look at their work. And so being able to have the student voices there was really, really wonderful, because it's something I've always wanted to do and really didn't have the the capacity to do in this way before now. And so you can kind of click through and hear from all the different students and the different artist teams that they were on, and some key takeaways that they want you to think about when you look at their work. And so that's all really been really excellent for us to include. And then the other thing that was excellent for us to include, but a lot of work, is that we actually, put the bibliography up, which again, in a physical exhibit, we never do. And so shout out to my collections assistant, Veronica, who actually edited the bibliography and put it together, but we're citing our work, and you can see through the list of collaborators, and I think through this list of references that the students pulled together, that there's a lot going on in this exhibit, right? There's a lot of work that they put into it, and we learned so much about these objects, which literally, thing on a table, no idea where it came from, no idea what it was, to knowing what everything is, who made it, when they made it, what it's of, and what ancient originals inspired it to really put these things back into circulation. So I think that was really really successful. Despite moving a physical class online, despite all of that, the students really approached the objects as material culture, not just about the representational qualities, but the physical qualities of the objects and how they've moved around and interacted with people in time. And we were able, through kind of careful design and conversations, to really put that into the exhibit as well. Okay, so with that in mind, let me see. So I would say I don't need to necessarily jump back into the PowerPoint to finish these comments up, but I would say on our kind of scorecard, the one thing that I really was the primary thing I wanted to do with SESTA going into this in the winter was to create this interactive base map. You will perhaps notice that nowhere on the exhibit that I just talked about is there an interactive base map. We don't have an interactive base map. We have a million other amazing things, but that one thing that I thought was my priority didn't happen. We've got all the content for it ready to go. Morel did tons of work, as you saw in that mock-up, kind of moving us towards that. But because we needed her to shift focus, we just had to be flexible. And she was flexible also, and did that work on those high resolution images to really move it forward. So that was really important, but that is life. However, we are partnering with SESTA again and have a student intern this quarter who is going to finish that base map. And so the base map is still going to be a supplement. So in that sense, we're kind of true to our original plan. It's just going to be a supplement to the digital exhibit at this time. Yeah, so besides that, I would say in terms of lessons, some of the practical lessons are that, really that website was not, there was almost nothing in it. There was some structure in there, and the interactives from Morel were in there, but besides that, that was all work that I did over the summer to put it together and put the images in there, which meant I learned a lot, but I wasn't really planning to spend my summer initially building a digital interactive. And so thinking about the amount of work that takes, which is more than a physical exhibit in all ways in terms of tracking and image permissions and the text and all of that. Was I a bit more ambitious in putting stuff in there than I needed to be? Probably, yes, because it was an opportunity to add the content that so often we have to cut from the physical exhibit, and to add it in a way that was meaningful and really represented those discoveries of the students. So in the future, will I try to dial it back a bit? Yes, but we'll see kind of how it actually works out. I would say also some of the lessons were, the weekly meetings that I had with Morel and with GP were crucial in the early stages, but certainly after the pivot to COVID and online, to really talk through all of these decisions and kind of figure out where everybody was at, keep everybody accountable, all of those things. And that the versioning and documentation of the project was also really robust, right? We've got spreadsheets and asset tracking and version dates of updates and all sorts of stuff going on to kind of keep everything together. There's still some challenges though about sustainability and ownership of content. And if either Sketchfab or Storymaps goes toes up, I don't know what's going to happen. So we do have those concerns for sure. And kind of a final lesson I would say is that we learned it was really, or not that this is a surprising lesson, but that I was hoping initially that we could have the base map interactive and the physical exhibit open at the same time in the spring. But we couldn't do that because of COVID. And even without COVID, I don't know that that would have worked. I don't know that that was a realistic expectation, even though I wanted to try. But I do think that this time around, compared with a previous work with a SESTA intern, there was much closer relationship between Morel and the class. So we had our SESTA RA, Morel was, met with the class 2 or 3 times, was able to get design feedback directly from them. And it was a much closer integration, both in terms of the class content and just collaboration. And so thinking about the SESTA intern for the digital interactive as a class member in a way is kind of a shift moving forward. So besides that, actually, I'm going to share the screen for PowerPoint just so you can see the thanks slide. And I will, with that, open it up for, I guess, questions, and just thanks everybody for your attention. All right, all of the thanks are there.
Thanks so much, Christina. That was fascinating. I think we already have several questions in the chat, and the first from Emma. I think so. Maybe she popped out. No, she's still here. Emma, okay. Maybe I can read your question. So question for Christina. How did the project budget evolve with the shift from the physical to the digital exhibit? Emma says, presumably you saved money on physical spaces, but lots of resources were required for digitization and online development.
Yeah. So in terms of the budget, we did save money in physical spaces. Like we don't have much of a budget, I'll say, but what we do have goes towards things like in our physical space, we can't take the bonnets off of our display cases ourselves. They're too big, so we have to have carpet or glazing come in and do that, painting the cases, taking the bonnets off, putting the bonnets back on. Those kinds of things, as well as printing costs for the images that we use in the exhibit design. So, going to Kinko's, getting those banners and, big foam core, beautiful printing of some of those images that you saw and will see in the exhibit costs a bit. So we did save there. In terms of going digital, there weren't really many more costs. We were really careful to source everything, but I think 3 or 4 images we had to pay for. Only one of them is not ours forever to use. So we did pretty well with that in terms of all the images, and really tried to source things that were Creative Commons or available through Library of Congress or something like that. But what we did not track was the labor cost for the digitization, where I had my staff digitizing things that should be done, but we weren't planning to do. That kind of work we just tend not to track, because that's almost all we do is the things maybe we weren't planning to do, but suddenly it's a priority. So that's a little harder to put a cost on. And then for the digitization, we really leaned heavily on SESTA, right? There's the VPUE cost of Morel. She was supported by that grant. So I think that we really, did a lot for not a lot of budget, but in terms of sustainability moving forward, that's a question that's still open.
I think the next question comes from Natalie Latari. Or do you want to ask, or I can? It's about, you mentioned, I think it's connected to what you mentioned earlier about how if some of the services go down, you don't know what will happen to the exhibit. So you're expecting the exhibit to be ongoing?
Yeah, once it's up, we're not going to take it down. Right? The dream of a curator, permanent exhibit forever. The work is always there. Everybody can see it around the world. So yeah, so I think that, but I'm also not planning to really update it much. So it's also just an experiment for us. This is the first one we've done, so we'll see how it goes. But we are planning to have it up. I do have dreams of the future, dreams in the future of getting, having that be a resource for outreach with, say, language classes, right? Getting Spanish translations or indigenous language translations of different components of it, for example, working it into our K through 12 outreach programs, those kinds of things. So we've got plans for it and hope that it can be a resource beyond the class, which the exhibits always are. But again, the reach and the, whatever permanence means on the web, I think are real great opportunities for us. I'm excited to see what we do with it, if we find the time and resources, or we find some good grad students interested in doing some stuff with it too.
Cool. Okay, we have several other questions. One more from Emma, if she can unmute herself this time. Okay.
Hi, yeah, thank you. And this is so inspiring. Thank you for sharing your work. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I was just curious about specifically about the ArcGIS Storymaps tool and what limitations you found working with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for story maps, for me, right, like I'm the curator exhibit design person normally, and so some of the limitations were really the design limitations of the platform itself. The tools that it has are great, but they are what they are, and there's a lot of automation. So there's no way I would be making something like that. However, those fonts are not the fonts I want, and the colors are not quite what I want, and the ways, especially the limitations on text sizes and text hierarchy. So if you go through the exhibit, which I hope people do, at least scroll through it, you'll see that one of the choices we made to highlight captions was to make them green instead of black, right? So we're marking captions as green text, but we ended up having to do that because certain places you put images don't come with a caption underneath it. Like maybe you can put the caption on for text readers, but most people are not viewing this with a text reader probably. And so, our curatorial reliance on captions to give credit and to gloss why we're showing you the thing we're showing you, like what you're supposed to see there, that was really limited in story maps. And then also the way it moves in with ArcGIS, there's still some stuff I'm trying to figure out about like layer permissions on some of the maps that maybe were transferred to me from Morel, but maybe weren't transferred to me from Morel. So I'm hoping that the public can see them on Friday, but I'm not 100% sure. So like those kinds of things are a little tricky as well. Yeah, so I think that, but any exhibit you're dealing with the limitations of reality. And so this was just learning the space of story maps and then working with it. So when I was talking about the kind of vertical scroll, the parallel scroll being something that, okay, we can work with this, the vertical scroll, we can work with this, and then that like sideways slideshow thing, once I discovered it could do that, I was like, oh, this will let me, give supplemental information, create a new interactive. So it was really kind of a learning process there. So positives and negatives. And if anybody wants to talk through that in a little bit more detail about any of this, yeah, definitely feel free to get in touch.
So the next question is Kiera Peacock. For you, or I can ask for her. Have you considered how you could use VR in the future?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. I mean, I think that, anytime you're doing 3D scanning, anytime you're thinking about, making material and experiential embodied stuff digital and kind of bringing these things together, I think that we are. But right now, like I personally do not know anything about it, and haven't experimented with it much except some Google Glass stuff with some artifact 3D models. That was frustrating, to be honest, in terms of navigating them. And so I think that this is an area where partnering, like with the 3D scans, like with SESTA, right? We would be really open to partnering and to have somebody kind of working with us on common goals in that area. So bring that expertise in for, things like creating this exhibit in a virtual space. We did a little Sketchfab model of it just as a mock-up when we were, working. One of my staff, Susie, did that when we were working on trying to figure out how to get scale into the virtual exhibit, into the digital exhibit. And so she created, that little room with the stuff on the walls, and even in Sketchpad being like, oh, we could put stuff here that we can't put in our physical cases, that we can't put in our physical exhibit. And even having that, experience of walking into a space and kind of seeing scale with the virtual bodies, we're really interested in that. We're thinking about that too. And we've seen a lot of galleries, a lot of art practice programs putting student works, pushing all of that online this past spring. And so I think that that's an important area for us in the future too. So yeah, great question.
Cynthia.
So I had two questions. The first is how you worked with your colleagues in the countries from which the artifacts and models came, if at all, if it was part of this project. And the second was whether you see any uses for this sort of exhibit in reducing the demand for illicit antiquities and looting.
Yeah, so those are really great questions. In terms of working, kind of doing community outreach and working directly with folks, the pre-work I did with that for the exhibit was, reaching out especially to language programs on campus for Nahuatl and for Maya language and Spanish as well, just kind of special languages, indigenous languages, to say, hey, we're doing this thing. Are you interested? Are your students interested? Can you help put me in touch with people? That was kind of in the winter, kind of late winter, that outreach really started. And I reached out to some people, got, hey, this sounds great, but didn't really build those relationships yet, and have some more emails, especially with the language programs, to build relationships. I think that part of it was that we didn't like this is always a challenge every year, in that one of the conceits of these exhibits is that we don't really know what we have until we do the exhibit, right? So we don't exactly know who to reach out to until we're like, oh, so this is Aztec, but this is Maya, and this is from Uluwan. Who is from where? What do we even do with that? Those kinds of things. So it's in a way giving us a platform then for me to do more educated outreach to communities and say, this is what we have, and we do think it's related to you, and would you be interested in doing more integration in the future? And the class also, because it's just, the class itself is like a 10-week thing. And so that also, knowing that relationship building with communities is a long-term process, that can be really challenging. But it's definitely on my mind, and did some work, and hopefully will, now that it's going live, we'll have something to show folks, say, here's what we have, and then we can kind of work on it that way. And then in terms of looting and things like that, I think looting is awful and terrible. I think I don't think a website like this is going to stop looting necessarily, but that is definitely not necessarily the looting piece of it, but the idea of objects remaining in their countries of origin, the idea of new kinds of kind of reverse repatriation, where maybe the object goes home, and we all in Western institutions have 3D models or printed models or something like that as a way to bring things in. I think really looking again at models as a serious teaching tool and object of inquiry is one of the lessons. And the students in the exhibit really talked about that, especially with the Merle Robertson rubbings, as a way to kind of get that, kind of communicate the importance and specialness, scale even, of original objects without, hauling a several ton stela in through the window of a museum, which is what happened with one of our originals. And then it went, it was hauled into the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, and then eventually went back to Honduras. It went back home. And so, yeah, that idea of the circulation of models versus originals, I think, is a really important one.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about how you conceptualize the difference between the 3D space of the gallery versus the room versus the virtual space of the screen when thinking about an exhibit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that I think was one of, and I talked about that a little bit, that was one of the major changes, is that, I realized that to what we always want to do with the digital projects is pay attention to their affordances, right? Like what can you do in a digital space? It is a space, right? It's embodied, it's experiential, it's, pixels on a screen, but there is a kind of sense of it, kind of embodied sense of it. And so what can you do with that? And not just like, hey, we put it online. Hey, isn't this 3D model cool? But having a reason for the things we do. And so thinking about that, just translating like, okay, here's our 4 physical cases. Let's make, 4 sections on the website, and each one will be a case. The Storymaps site, because of its because it has kind of that linear scroll, lends itself more to narrative than to kind of, oh, let me look over here and then let me look over there. And so having a more kind of opt-in, opt-out, non-linear physical exhibit was one thing, but the linearity of the story map space and experience was one of the big shifts. And so that's where it came to narrating in a way the students' research experience through the story map, instead of the physical exhibit, which would have been much more like, all right, here's this artist, here's that artist, all of those different sections in a single case. It really kind of shifted it more towards narrative and more linear storytelling.
Cool. I did also hear you though when you said that on the one hand that there were linear through lines through the exhibit, but that it was also going another direction.
Yeah, and that I think is something that to me is one of the more interesting realizations about Storymap, or about the stuff online as well. I think I personally, like, if you see how I organize information, I organize it in a very like outline, linear, hierarchical way. And so that makes sense to me. But that sideways thing for me was like, oh, a little bit of a realization that you could have this branch and go kind of sideways into the slideshow. So like scroll down, see curatorial statements, and then just like go dive into statements from each of the students, for example. And I think that that's something either in Storymaps or in other modes that I'm interested in kind of seeing what can be done there, and how that not necessarily mimics, but provides something different than the organization of a physical exhibit would.
I think Giovanna has a question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Christina. That was so compelling. It's so great to hear, having seen also parts of this, of the story taking place.
Yeah,
it's amazing what you made out of this, and it raises so many interesting questions. One, I'm thinking of of 2 things that are slightly related. One is something that I've been told recently, even just in an announcing a SESTA event, and somebody pointed out to me, you should really try to make this to add to the announcement something that makes it clear that this is virtual events of the moment, like in a way that can we construct like evidence of, or like mark that this is not just like what is specific and why things are different now. And it's interesting to me because this is what in fact museums have started doing, right? They're also called for collecting objects that will preserve the moment. At the same time, the New York Times, when they said an article a week ago saying build your time bottle of the pandemic, they also say don't do it digitally because you lose it, like, so it's but I wonder if there is something like, I imagine you will talk about this narratively, but if you would feel that you want to mark, or what would be the mark of the moment in the way that then the exhibit is this beautiful also thing that would have happened in any case. But so that's my question. And the other that is slightly related is when you said this can be there forever, isn't that the dream of a curator, which is so beautiful to hear? Because in a way, I think like in my actual books, I still have books of, when you think an exhibition is fantastic and you buy the catalog, which is always an additional expense. I mean, there is a lot of thinking that goes into it, and they get, but it's true that otherwise there is it's hard to preserve beyond your own memory what an exhibition was. And so I wonder is this, I can already think myself, but how much this is very different from a catalog, if you had to try to think of what's different between the two. So
yeah. Well, I can certainly. I mean, I think that what's different between this and the catalog is that it is it's got the linear experience, but the emphasis is really on the exploration of the objects. I think the integration of the 3D is an important part of that, and the idea also just thematically that, which if we did a catalog, we'd probably put it there too, just because of what we do, but that, what this is an invitation to come along with the students on their research journey, where they're confronted by these objects, start with the model, kind of look at what's going on with it, and then try to make sense of it as an object in itself, like as an object in the colonial power relations and modernity in the different countries of Mesoamerica, in all of these other things. And so I don't know if certainly a traditional kind of art catalog would be as focused on the process of discovery as ours is. And I think, a catalog also still would probably have, even though there's a lot of text in there compared with what we usually do, a catalog would still have kind of more text and would be speaking with an authoritative voice about, like, here's what these objects are, here's what you should be looking at. Whereas this, it's not scholarly, because you saw the reference list, it really is, but the students are really like, look what I discovered, right? Like, look what this made me think about, look what I'm bothered by in this object. And so I think that is something that characterizes the exhibits that we do, is that focus. So that I think is one of the differences, as well as the kind of the interactive and the little choose your own adventure, scroll through, whatever kind of stuff, for sure. And then in terms of marking it as of this moment, I mean, I think the fact that it's a digital exhibit at all is the mark for us. Whether, in 5 years anybody's going to remember that, or it's still going to be visible, I don't know. So the idea of trying to incorporate something about COVID in there, I don't know, like we weren't explicitly thinking about that, except thematically in the ways that everything digital got this huge spotlight thrown onto it after COVID. And we were already thinking about, what does it mean to have a digital object? What is virtual materiality? And so that we were already focused on that, which is part of why I think this just fit well with the move we had to make. Because we're not explicitly talking about it, but we're thinking about that in our own small, somewhat esoteric way. We're engaged with some of that, which I think is important. And I also wanted to clarify that idea, the kind of the dream of having the exhibits around forever, or having it there forever, is partially because I'm proud of the work and want what the students done to be out there, to have people engage with it when they're ready to engage with it, all of those things. But also, looking back and having the ability to really see previous exhibits as a part of historicizing and critiquing what museums do, I think is really important too, right? So I don't want to preserve it because I think it's the best thing ever, but I think that, somebody should come along and like really critique this and like figure out what we're doing, down the line for something like what happened during COVID. How did museums cope? Like, I don't know, come look at our exhibit and see. So the idea of having these things around as their own primary sources for reflexive museology, critical curation, all of that, I think is part of that dream, for sure.